Some wounds never heal and some debts are never forgotten. In a dusty frontier town, 60-year-old cowboy Caleb Boone was just passing through until a ragged dog changed everything. Within minutes, every door slammed shut, every window shuttered closed. The entire village went silent as death. Caleb has seen secrets buried in small towns, but this feels different. As the dog leads him through empty alleyways and abandoned barns, he uncovers pieces of a tragedy someone desperately wants hidden. Haunted by loss of his son and years of regrets, Caleb finds himself drawn into a quiet battle for truth where silence has reigned. But what terrible secret could make an entire town disappear behind locked doors? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the main street of Millhaven, a town that had seen better decades. Caleb Boone guided his mare, Sage, down the dusty thoroughfare, noting how the wooden sidewalks creaked under even the gentlest weight of years. Paint peeled from storefront signs like old skin, and more than half the buildings stood empty, their windows reflecting nothing but sky and regret. At 62, Caleb carried himself with the deliberate movements of a man who had learned that rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes led to consequences he was still paying for. His weathered hands held Sage's reins with the same careful attention he gave to everything these days, measured, thoughtful, tinged with the kind of caution that comes from losing what matters most. The dog appeared as if summoned from the dust itself. One moment, the street stretched empty before them. The next, a medium-sized mutt sat directly in their path. The animal's coat bore the mottled brown and black of mixed breeding, but its eyes held an intelligence that made Caleb pull Sage to a stop. Those eyes seemed to look right through him, past the worn denim and faded cotton shirt, past the silver stubble and sun-carved lines around his eyes, straight into the place where he kept his failures. "Easy, a girl," Caleb murmured to Sage, though the horse showed no signs of skittishness. If anything, she seemed as curious about the dog as he was. The dog remained motionless, watching, waiting. Caleb had been traveling for 3 days since leaving the ranch outside Tucson, following work, leads that grew more scarce with each passing year. Millhaven was supposed to be a brief stop, water for Sage, maybe a hot meal and a clean bed, if the town still had a functioning hotel. He had not planned on staying long enough to meet anyone, let alone engage in a staring contest with a stray dog. "Move along, boy," he called softly, but the dog didn't budge. Instead, it stood and approached with measured steps, its head slightly tilted. As it drew closer, Caleb noticed something unusual around its neck. Not a collar exactly, but a makeshift arrangement of worn leather strips and faded rope. Something small dangled from it, catching the morning light. That was when the first door slammed. The sharp crack echoed off the empty storefronts, followed immediately by another, then another. Caleb's head snapped up to see windows sliding shut, curtains being drawn, shutters folding closed with hasty precision. Within moments, the main street transformed from merely empty to actively hostile, as if the town itself had decided he was unwelcome. Sage shifted beneath him, picking up on the sudden tension. Caleb's hand instinctively moved to rest on his thigh, a habit from years when he might have worn a sidearm. Those days were long past, but the reflexes remained. The dog had stopped just out of arm's reach, still watching him with those unsettling eyes. Now that it stood closer, Caleb could see the object hanging from its improvised collar more clearly, a small, rectangular shape wrapped in what looked like oiled cloth. "What have you got there, friend?" Caleb asked, his voice carrying the gentle tone he had once used with his son during their fishing trips to the creek behind their old house. The memory surfaced unbidden, as they always did, bringing with it the familiar ache of things left unsaid and chances missed forever. The dog took another step forward and sat again, this time close enough that Caleb could reach down from Sage's back if he wanted to. The invitation seemed clear, though why a stray dog would want interaction with a stranger remained unclear. Caleb glanced around the now shuttered street. Whatever had caused the town's collective retreat, it seemed connected to either his presence or the dog's, possibly both. In his experience, small towns reacted to strangers in one of two ways, with curious hospitality or suspicious withdrawal. Milhaven had chosen the latter with remarkable speed and coordination. He dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. Sage stood patiently as he approached the dog, which remained sitting but alert. Up close, Caleb could see the wear in the animal's coat, the slight prominence of ribs beneath the fur, the careful way it held one front paw, as if it had been injured some time ago. "You've been on your own a while, haven't you?" he said, crouching down to the dog's level. This close, he could see that the wrapped object was indeed a photograph, protected by what looked like a piece of canvas tarp. The leather strips holding it had been carefully knotted, as if someone had taken great care to ensure it wouldn't be lost. The dog lifted its paw, the same one it had been favoring, and placed it gently on Caleb's knee. The gesture felt remarkably human, a request for help or perhaps an offer of alliance. "Let's see what you're carrying," Caleb said, reaching slowly for the makeshift collar. The dog remained perfectly still as he worked to untie the knots, which proved more complex than they had first appeared. Someone had taken considerable time and care in their construction. The canvas wrapping came away to reveal a photograph, faded but still clear. It showed a family, a man, woman, and young boy, standing in front of what looked like a house or possibly a school building. The boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, was holding something in his arms. Another dog, Caleb realized with a start. A dog that looked remarkably similar to the one now sitting beside him. He turned the photograph over. In careful handwriting, someone had written, "Tommy, Sarah, and little Jake with Rusty. Summer 1993. Always together." Caleb stared at the date. 30 years ago. If this dog was the same Rusty from the photograph, it would have to be impossibly old. Yet something in the animal's eyes suggested a connection to that image, a recognition that went beyond mere coincidence. "Where did you get this, boy?" he asked, but the dog had already stood and begun walking toward one of the shuttered buildings. It paused after a few steps and looked back, clearly expecting Caleb to follow. From somewhere nearby came the sound of footsteps on wooden planks, but when Caleb looked around, he saw no one. The footsteps stopped abruptly, as if whoever had been walking had suddenly decided to stand very still. Caleb folded the photograph carefully and slipped it into his shirt pocket. Whatever story it told, whatever connection it had to this dog and this suddenly hostile town, he sensed it was important. The careful way it had been preserved, the deliberate placement around the dog's neck, someone had wanted it to be found, had trusted this animal to carry it until the right person came along. The question was whether he was that person. His son, Danny's face flashed through his mind, not as he had been at the end, angry and disappointed and walking away for the last time, but as he had been as a child, eager and trusting and full of questions about everything. Danny had loved animals, especially dogs, though Caleb's work schedule and practical concerns had always prevented them from getting one. "Next year," he had always said, "when things settle down." But things had never settled down, and then Danny was grown and gone, and the chance for shared walks and thrown sticks and all the simple joys of a boy and his dog had passed forever. The dog, Rusty, if that was indeed his name, continued to wait patiently for Caleb to follow. Behind the shuttered windows, Caleb could sense eyes watching, though he saw no movement. The feeling of being observed was strong enough to raise the hair on his arms. Sage nickered softly behind him, a reminder that whatever he decided to do, she would need water and rest before long. The smart thing would be to mount up, ride through town, find another place to stop for the night. The safe thing, the practical thing, but the photograph in his pocket seemed to weigh more than it should. And the dog's patient gaze reminded him too much of another pair of eyes, younger ones, human ones that had once looked at him with similar trust and hope. "All right," he said quietly, as much to himself as to the dog. "Show me what you want me to see." Rusty's tail wagged once, a single sweep that might have been approval or simply acknowledgement. He began walking again, this time with more purpose, leading Caleb away from the main street toward a narrow alley that ran between what had once been a general store and a barber shop. As they walked, Caleb noticed details that spoke to the town's decline. Weeds grew thick between loose boards in the sidewalk. Paint had faded and peeled until some buildings showed more bare wood than color. Several storefronts bore hand-lettered signs announcing they were closed temporarily, though the dust on the windows suggested the temporary had become permanent some time ago. Yet despite the obvious economic hardship, the buildings were structurally sound. Someone had been maintaining them, keeping roofs intact and foundations stable even if they couldn't afford fresh paint or new signs. This was not a town that had been abandoned suddenly, but one that was holding on, maintaining what it could while waiting for better times that might never come. The alley led to a wider street behind the main row of businesses. Here Caleb could see more signs of current habitation: laundry hanging on lines, small gardens tucked between buildings, the occasional glimpse of movement behind windows. People lived here still, but they were keeping deliberately out of sight. Rusty stopped in front of a small building that had clearly once been a school. The structure was single-story, built of local stone, with a pitched roof and tall windows designed to let in maximum light. A weathered sign above the door read, "Millhaven Elementary, established 1889. The windows were boarded up now, and the door showed a heavy chain and padlock. But the building had been maintained better than many others. The dog sat down again and looked up at Caleb expectantly. "This is where you wanted to bring me?" Caleb asked. "The old school?" Rusty stood and walked around the building's corner, pausing again to ensure Caleb was following. On the side of the building, partially hidden by overgrown bushes, was a smaller door marked Teacher's Entrance. This door showed no chain or padlock, though it was clearly locked. The dog began pawing at the ground near the door's base, his actions focused and deliberate. After a moment, his efforts revealed a loose board in the building's foundation. Behind the board was a small opening, just large enough for a person to crawl through. Caleb knelt down and peered into the darkness beyond the opening. The space seemed to open into the building's interior, though he could see little in the dim light. The air that drifted out carried the scent of old wood and dust. But underneath it was something else, something that reminded him of the way his grandmother's attic had smelled, full of stored memories and forgotten treasures. "You want me to go in there?" he said to the dog. It wasn't really a question. Rusty's response was to squeeze through the opening himself, disappearing into the building's interior. From inside came the sound of movement, and then a single soft bark. Not urgent or alarmed, but clearly an invitation. Caleb looked back toward the main street, though the school building blocked his view of it. The town remained eerily quiet, as if everyone was holding their breath and waiting for something to happen. He thought about the photograph in his pocket, about the careful way it had been preserved and carried, about the intelligence in the dog's eyes, and the purposeful way he had led Caleb here, 30 years ago. According to the photograph's inscription, a family with a dog named Rusty, and now, in a town that wanted no strangers, a dog that might or might not be the same animal was leading him towards secrets. Hidden in an abandoned school, the rational part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive through decades of dangerous work and difficult choices, suggested this was none of his business. Whatever had happened here was in the past, and the present held enough troubles without borrowing more from history. But the other part of his mind, the part that still carried the weight of his own failures and the memory of his son's disappointed face, whispered that some debts could only be paid by helping others, and some redemption could only be found by refusing to walk away when walking away would be easier. Caleb took off his hat and squeezed through the opening. The interior of the schoolhouse held the suspended quality of a place where time had stopped suddenly, mid-sentence. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light that managed to penetrate the boarded windows, and the air carried decades of accumulated silence. Caleb found himself in what had once been a classroom, complete with small desks still arranged in neat rows and a blackboard that bore the ghost images of long-erased lessons. Rusty moved through the space with the confidence of familiarity, weaving between the desks toward the front of the room. His nails clicked softly against the worn wooden floors, the only sound breaking the heavy quiet. Caleb followed more cautiously, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The classroom had been abandoned, but not vandalized. No broken windows or graffiti, no signs of the casual destruction that usually followed when buildings were left unguarded. Someone had simply walked away one day and never returned, leaving everything exactly as it had been, on the teacher's desk. A calendar was still turned to September 1993, the same year as the photograph. September, Caleb murmured, approaching the desk. School year just starting. Several dates were circled in red ink: parent conferences, a Halloween party, something called Mining History Day scheduled for the end of the month. Normal activities for a normal school year that had apparently ended abruptly. Rusty had moved beyond the classroom into what looked like a small hallway. His behavior had changed subtly, less patient exploration, more urgent purpose. When Caleb joined him, the dog was pawing at a section of flooring near what appeared to be the back entrance to the building. "What is it, boy?" Caleb knelt beside the dog and examined the area more closely. The floorboards here were slightly different from the others, as if they had been replaced or repaired. He pressed down on them experimentally and felt a subtle give that suggested loose nails or warped wood. Rusty continued pawing, and Caleb realized the dog wasn't randomly scratching, but focusing on a specific spot. Using his pocket knife, he worked to pry up one of the loose boards. It came away more easily than expected, revealing a small cavity beneath the floor. Inside was a child's toy, a wooden horse, hand-carved and painted with the kind of care that spoke of love rather than mass production. The paint had faded, but Caleb could still make out the details: a flowing mane, gentle eyes, a saddle painted in blue and gold. On the horse's side, carved deep into the wood, were the initials J.M. Jake from the photograph. Jake with his family and his dog Rusty. Caleb lifted the toy horse from its hiding place and turned it over in his hands. The craftsmanship was exceptional. Someone had spent considerable time and skill creating this for a child they cared about deeply. The wood was smooth from years of handling, and despite its long concealment, it remained solid and well-preserved. "Yours, was it?" he asked Rusty quietly. The dog whined softly, a sound that somehow managed to convey both affection and loss. A loud bang from outside shattered the quiet contemplation. Heavy footsteps approached the building, accompanied by voices, more than one person, walking with purpose rather than casual intent. "I'm telling you, I saw him go around back," a man's voice said, rough with authority and irritation. "Outsiders got no business poking around here." "Maybe he's just passing through, Sheriff," replied a second voice, younger and less certain. "Nobody just passes through anymore, and you know it." "Not since—" The voice stopped abruptly, as if the speaker had caught himself before saying too much. Caleb slipped the wooden horse into his pocket alongside the photograph and moved quietly toward the front of the building. Through a gap in the boarded window, he could see two men standing near where he had left Sage. One wore a sheriff's badge on a khaki uniform that had seen better days. The other was younger, possibly a deputy, though Caleb couldn't see a badge from his angle. The sheriff was examining Sage with the practiced eye of someone evaluating potential trouble. "Arizona plates on the trailer," he said to his companion. Long way from home, Caleb made a decision. Staying hidden would only make him look guilty of something, and he had done nothing wrong beyond following a dog and picking up a child's toy. He moved back to the opening in the foundation and squeezed through, emerging into the daylight with deliberate calm. "Afternoon," he called as he walked around to the front of the building. "Beautiful day for a ride." The sheriff spun around, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon before stopping. Up close, Caleb could see he was probably in his 50s, with the soft appearance of someone who had stopped doing physical work some time ago. His eyes held the wariness of a man who had seen too much and trusted too little. "You the owner of that horse?" the sheriff asked, though they both knew the answer. "I am. Caleb Boone." He extended his hand in greeting, noting how the sheriff hesitated before accepting it briefly. "Sheriff Morrison." "This is Deputy Collins." The younger man nodded nervously. "Mind telling me what you're doing on school property?" Following a dog," Caleb replied honestly. "Seemed like he wanted to show me something." "What dog?" Morrison's eyes narrowed, scanning the area around the building. Caleb looked around, realizing that Rusty had vanished as completely as he had first appeared. There was no sign of the animal anywhere near the schoolhouse, despite the fact that Caleb had been with him just moments before. "Brown and black mutt," Caleb said. "Medium size, wearing a makeshift collar. He was right here a minute ago." Morrison and Collins exchanged a look that seemed to carry more meaning than a simple shared glance. The deputy's face had gone pale, and the sheriff's jaw tightened visibly. "Mister, I'm going to give you some free advice," Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of authority and warning. "This is a quiet town that likes to keep to itself. We don't get many visitors, and when we do, they tend to move along pretty quick. Be best if you did the same. Is there some kind of trouble here?" Caleb asked. "Something I should know about?" "No trouble at all, long as folks mind their own business." Morrison's hand rested on his gun belt now, not quite a threat, but close enough to be noticed. "But sometimes outsiders get ideas, start poking around where they shouldn't, asking questions that don't concern them. That kind of thing can lead to misunderstandings." Caleb considered his options. He could mount Sage and ride away, leave Millhaven and whatever secrets it held behind him. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. The sheriff was clearly warning him off for reasons that went beyond normal small-town suspicion of strangers, but the wooden horse in his pocket seemed to weigh more than wood should, and somewhere in the back of his mind he could hear Danny's voice from years ago. "Dad, why don't grown-ups ever try to help when bad things happen?" "I understand your position, Sheriff," Caleb said carefully, "but I'm not looking for trouble. Just following work leads and happened to stop here for supplies." "Well, you won't find much in the way of supplies," Morrison replied. "Most of our businesses are closed these days. Nearest place for what you'd need is probably 30 miles east in Cedar Ridge." It was clearly a dismissal, but before Caleb could respond, a new voice entered the conversation. "Sheriff Morrison, is there some kind of problem here?" All three men turned to see an elderly woman approaching from the direction of the main street. She walked slowly but steadily, using a wooden cane that looked hand-carved. Her grey hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and despite her age, her eyes were sharp and alert. "No problem at all, Mrs. Henderson," Morrison said, though his tone suggested he wasn't pleased by her appearance. "Just having a friendly chat with this visitor about the best roads out of town." Mrs. Henderson's gaze settled on Caleb with curious intensity. "Visitor? We don't get many of those anymore." She paused, studying his face, as if trying to remember something. "You wouldn't be looking for work, would you?" "We used to have men come through looking for ranch work or mining jobs." "Ma'am," Morrison interrupted, his voice sharp with warning, "I'm sure this gentleman needs to be moving along." But Mrs. Henderson continued to study Caleb, and he saw something in her, expression that reminded him of the dog's intelligent gaze, a sense that she was trying to communicate something important, without saying it directly. "Mining jobs," she repeated slowly. "Haven't had those in 30 years now. Not since the accident." The word hung in the air like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of tension through the small group. Deputy Collins shifted uncomfortably, and Sheriff Morrison's face darkened with what looked like anger. "Mrs. Henderson," Morrison said, his voice carrying clear warning now, "I think you might want to head on home. Looks like it could rain later." The sky was cloudless, but the elderly woman nodded as if she understood a different message entirely. "Of course, Sheriff. You're quite right." She turned to go, then paused and looked back at Caleb. "If you do decide to stay the night, the old boarding house might still have a room. 2 blocks down from the main street, white house with green shutters. Mrs. Santos might be willing to help a traveler." Then she was walking away, leaving Caleb with the distinct impression that he had just received more than directions to lodging. Morrison waited until she was out of earshot before turning back to Caleb. "Like I said, mister, best thing would be for you to move along. Today." "I appreciate the advice," Caleb replied, mounting Sage and gathering the reins. "I'll take it under consideration." As he rode away from the schoolhouse, Caleb could feel the sheriff's eyes on his back. But his attention was drawn to movement in his peripheral vision, a flash of brown and black disappearing behind a building 2 blocks away. Rusty was still around, still watching, still waiting for something. The wooden horse and the photograph in his pocket told a story that was only beginning to unfold. And despite the sheriff's warning, or perhaps because of it, Caleb found himself more interested in hearing the rest of it than in moving on to safer ground. Some debts, he was beginning to realize, could only be paid by refusing to look away when looking away would be easier. And some dogs, it seemed, were willing to wait 30 years for the right person to follow them home. Caleb found the boarding house exactly where Mrs. Henderson had described it, a 2-story white structure with faded green shutters that had once been vibrant, but now carried the muted tones of age and weather. The sign by the front gate read, "Santos House, rooms available," though the paint was so faded that the words were barely legible. Mrs. Santos turned out to be a compact woman in her 70s, with kind eyes and hands that spoke of a lifetime of practical work. She asked no questions beyond whether he needed a room for 1 night or more, and seemed genuinely pleased to have a guest. "Haven't had many travelers lately," she said, leading him up a narrow staircase to a small but clean room on the 2nd floor. "Most folks just pass through now without stopping. Seems like a nice enough place to stop," Caleb replied, testing the bed and finding it satisfactory. It was. Once Mrs. Santos paused in the doorway, as if debating whether to say more. Things changed, though. Sometimes not for the better. After she left, Caleb stood at the room's single window and looked out over the town. From this vantage point, he could see the schoolhouse in the distance, and beyond it the hills that surrounded Millhaven like protective walls. Or perhaps, he thought, like prison walls, depending on your perspective. He pulled the wooden horse from his pocket and set it on the small table beside the bed. In the afternoon light, streaming through the window, he could see details he had missed earlier, tiny scratches in the paint that suggested years of careful play, and carved into the base, barely visible, the initials TM, presumably for the craftsman who had made it. The photograph lay beside the horse, and Caleb studied it again. The family looked happy, genuinely so, not the forced cheerfulness of posed portraits. The boy, Jake, was grinning with the unguarded joy that children possessed before life taught them caution. His father had one hand on the boy's shoulder, and his mother was laughing at something outside the camera's view. And there was Rusty, or his ancestor, alert and intelligent even in the stillness of the photograph. What had happened to them? And why did the mention of an accident 30 years ago cause such obvious discomfort among the townspeople? As evening approached, Caleb made a decision. He would return to the schoolhouse after dark, when prying eyes were less likely to notice. If Rusty wanted to show him something, he owed it to the dog, and to the memory of his own son to look. The streets of Millhaven were quiet after sunset, lit only by a few scattered streetlights that cast pools of yellow illumination surrounded by deep shadows. Caleb walked slowly, keeping to the darker areas, listening for any sounds that might indicate he was being watched or followed. The schoolhouse stood silent and dark against the night sky. Caleb made his way around to the back entrance and squeezed through the foundation opening once again. This time he had brought a small flashlight, and its beam revealed details he had missed in the dim afternoon light. The interior was exactly as he had left it, but with better illumination. He could see that the building had been abandoned suddenly rather than gradually. In one of the classrooms, he found children's artwork still pinned to a bulletin board, crayon drawings of families and houses and dogs that looked remarkably like Rusty. The drawings were dated September 1993, Just weeks before the calendar on the teacher's desk indicated the school year had ended. In the main classroom, Caleb examined the teacher's desk more carefully. The drawers were still filled with the normal accumulation of educational materials, red pens, grade books, boxes of chalk. But in the bottom drawer, hidden beneath a stack of unused worksheets, he found something that made him pause. It was a torn piece of paper, heavy stock, like the kind used for official documents or maps. Most of it was missing, but what remained showed a portion of what appeared to be a property survey map. Several areas were marked with red ink, and handwritten notes in the margins indicated specific locations: mine entrance number 3, equipment storage, and employee housing. The paper was torn deliberately, not accidentally. Someone had taken care to remove the majority of the map while leaving this fragment behind. But why leave any of it? Unless they had been interrupted, or unless they had wanted someone specific to find it. Caleb heard the soft click of nails on wood before he saw the dog. Rusty appeared in the classroom doorway as silently as he had vanished earlier, watching Caleb with that same intelligent expression. "You again," Caleb said quietly. "You've been waiting for me to come back, haven't you?" Rusty approached the desk and sniffed at the map fragment, then looked up at Caleb expectantly. The meaning seemed clear. This was what he had wanted Caleb to find. "You know what this is, don't you?" Caleb asked, studying the partial map more carefully. "These locations, they mean something to you." The dog moved to the window and whined softly, looking out toward the hills beyond the town. Following his gaze, Caleb could see lights in the distance. Not house lights, but something brighter and more industrial. Mining equipment, perhaps, or security lighting around some kind of facility. Rusty returned to Caleb's side and gently took the sleeve of his jacket in his teeth, tugging toward the door. The message was unmistakable. He wanted Caleb to follow him again, this time toward whatever lay in those hills. But as they prepared to leave the schoolhouse, the sound of approaching vehicles made them both freeze. Car doors slammed, and harsh voices cut through the night air. "I told you he'd be back here." Sheriff Morrison's voice was angry and tired. "Outsiders never listen to good advice. What do you want to do?" Deputy Collins sounded nervous, as he had earlier. "We're going to have a more direct conversation this time. Some people need clearer explanations about why they shouldn't stick their noses where they don't belong." Caleb quickly pocketed the map fragment and moved toward the back of the building with Rusty. But as they reached the foundation opening, bright lights flooded the area around the schoolhouse. Flashlight beams probed the shadows, and he could hear at least 3 different voices now. "Check the back," Morrison ordered. "If he's in there, I want to know about it." Caleb found himself trapped between the approaching searchers and his only exit. But Rusty seemed to know another way. The dog led him deeper into the building, toward what had once been a small storage room. In the far corner, partially hidden by stacked boxes, was another opening, this one leading to what appeared to be a basement or cellar. Without hesitation, Rusty disappeared through the opening. Caleb followed, dropping down into a space that smelled of earth and old wood. His flashlight revealed a narrow tunnel that seemed to run beneath the building and beyond. Above them, heavy footsteps entered the schoolhouse. "He was here," Morrison's voice echoed through the floorboards. Still warm air from where someone was breathing. Caleb and Rusty moved quickly through the tunnel, which gradually sloped upward until they emerged through a concealed opening in the hillside several hundred yards from the schoolhouse. Looking back, Caleb could see the lights still moving around the building as the searchers continued their hunt. "An escape route," he murmured to Rusty. "Someone built this for emergencies." The dog was already moving again, leading him up the hillside toward the lights they had seen from the schoolhouse window. As they climbed, Caleb could make out more details of the facility ahead: chain-link fencing, warning signs, and what looked like the entrance to a mine shaft. The map fragment in his pocket suddenly made more sense. These were the locations marked in red: mine entrances, storage areas, housing. This was where whatever had happened 30 years ago had begun. But as they approached the fence line, Caleb realized they were no longer alone. A figure detached itself from the shadows near the gate. A man, wearing expensive clothes that seemed out of place in the rural setting. "I was wondering when you'd show up," the man said, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Sheriff Morrison mentioned we might have a visitor who was having trouble understanding the concept of private property." Caleb stopped walking, but kept his hand near the pocket containing the map fragment. "Just out for an evening walk. Nice view from up here." "Indeed it is." The man stepped into the light cast by the facility's security lamps. He was perhaps 50, well-groomed, with the soft hands of someone who worked behind a desk rather than with tools. "Richard Blackwood. I represent the interests that own this property. Caleb Boone. I represent my own interests, which at the moment include a peaceful walk." Blackwood's smile was cold and practiced. "Mr. Boone, I'm going to be very direct with you. This town has a history of dealing harshly with people who involve themselves in matters that don't concern them. 30 years ago, some people learned that lesson the hard way. The threat was barely veiled, but what struck Caleb more was the casual way Blackwood admitted knowledge of events from 3 decades past. Whatever had happened here, this man knew about it, possibly had been involved in it. "Sounds like quite a story," Caleb said carefully. "Must have been before my time." "Yes, well, history has a way of repeating itself when people don't learn from past examples." Blackwood glanced at Rusty, who had remained perfectly still during the conversation. "Interesting companion you have there, very familiar-looking." The comment sent a chill down Caleb's spine. If Blackwood recognized the dog, or thought he did, then the connections between past and present were more complex than Caleb had realized. "Dogs tend to look alike in the dark," Caleb replied. "Perhaps. But some things and some people have a way of coming back when you least expect them." Blackwood turned to go, then paused. "Enjoy the rest of your evening walk, Mr. Boone, and do be careful on these hills. They can be quite dangerous, especially for someone unfamiliar with the terrain." As Blackwood disappeared back into the facility, Caleb felt the weight of the man's threat and the growing certainty that he had stumbled into something much larger and more dangerous than a simple town secret. The map fragment, the wooden horse, the photograph, and now this midnight encounter. They were all pieces of a puzzle that someone had been working very hard to keep unsolved. Beside him, Rusty whined softly and pressed against his leg, as if offering comfort or seeking it. Whatever had brought them together, whatever story the dog was trying to tell, Caleb was beginning to understand that some truths were worth the risk of uncovering them. The next morning brought low clouds and the smell of rain in the air. Caleb woke early, as was his habit, and found Mrs. Santos already preparing breakfast in the boarding house kitchen. She moved with the efficient grace of someone who had been caring for others for decades, and the coffee she offered was strong enough to chase away the lingering shadows of the previous night's encounter. "Sleep well?" she asked, though something in her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Well enough," Caleb replied, accepting the cup gratefully. "Quiet town you have here." Mrs. Santos paused in her work, her hands stilling over the cast-iron skillet. "Quiet, yes, but not peaceful. There's a difference, you know." Before Caleb could respond, a soft scratching at the kitchen door interrupted them. Mrs. Santos opened it to reveal Rusty sitting patiently on the back porch, his coat damp with morning dew. "Well now," she said, studying the dog with obvious recognition. "I haven't seen you in a long time, old friend." Rusty's tail wagged once, but his attention remained focused on Caleb. The message was clear. He was ready to continue whatever journey they had begun. "You know this dog?" Caleb asked. Mrs. Santos was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands gripping the doorframe. "I knew a dog that looked very much like him. Long time ago now, before things changed." "What kind of things?" "The kind that make people stop talking about the past." She glanced around nervously, as if afraid someone might be listening. "But some stories don't stay buried, no matter how deep you dig the hole." Rusty stood and walked to the edge of the porch, looking back expectantly. His meaning was unmistakable. It was time to go. Caleb finished his coffee and gathered his things. Whatever Rusty wanted to show him next, he had the feeling it would provide more pieces to the puzzle that was taking shape. The map fragment in his pocket seemed to pulse with importance, and Blackwood's threat from the night before only reinforced his growing certainty that powerful people had worked hard to keep something hidden. The dog led him away from the main part of town, following a dirt road that wound up into the hills. As they walked, Caleb noticed abandoned equipment scattered along the roadside, rusted mining machinery, old rail ties, and the skeletal remains of structures that had once supported some kind of industrial operation. The farther they traveled from town, the more evidence of past mining activity became apparent. Slag heaps dotted the landscape, and the scarred earth bore the distinctive marks of open-pit excavation. This had once been a major operation, the kind that could support an entire community for generations. After nearly an hour of walking, Rusty stopped beside what appeared to be the entrance to a mine shaft. Unlike the facility they had visited the night before, this one was clearly abandoned. The equipment was rusted beyond repair, and the entrance itself was partially collapsed. A weathered sign warned of dangerous conditions and unstable ground, but Rusty seemed unconcerned by the warnings. He approached a section of the mine entrance that was still accessible and disappeared into the darkness beyond. Caleb followed reluctantly, using his flashlight to navigate the uneven ground and fallen timbers. The mine shaft extended deeper than he had expected, branching into multiple tunnels that spoke to decades of excavation. The air was still and heavy, carrying the mineral scent of deep earth and old work. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, a steady rhythm that echoed off the stone walls. Rusty led him down the main shaft for perhaps 50 yards before turning into a smaller side tunnel. Here the ceiling was lower and the walls showed more recent damage, places where the rock had shifted or collapsed in the years since the mine was abandoned. At the end of the tunnel, Rusty stopped beside a pile of fallen stones. He began pawing at the rubble with urgent purpose, and Caleb joined him in moving the smaller rocks aside. Beneath them, partially buried but protected from the worst of the collapse, was a silver locket. Caleb lifted it carefully from its hiding place. The locket was tarnished but intact, suspended from a delicate chain that had somehow survived the years underground. On the front was an engraved design, a heart surrounded by small flowers, the kind of jewelry a parent might give to a beloved child. The locket opened with a soft click to reveal a photograph inside. It showed a young boy, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, with dark hair and serious eyes. But what stopped Caleb's breath was the resemblance, not to Jake from the family photograph, but to his own son Danny at that age. The similarity was striking enough to make his hands shake. The shape of the face, the way the boy held his head slightly tilted, even the expression in his eyes. It was as if he was looking at a photograph of Danny taken 30 years before Danny had been born. "Dear God," he whispered, staring at the image. For a moment, the present faded away, and he was back in his own kitchen, watching Danny eat breakfast before school, listening to his questions about why the sky was blue and where the horses dreamed, and if grown-ups ever got scared of the dark. He had never told Danny that yes, grown-ups got scared all the time, of failure, of loss, of the moment when they would have to admit they couldn't protect the people they loved from everything. He had thought there would be time for those conversations later, when Danny was older and better able to understand the complexities of being human. But there had been no later. The argument that drove Danny away had been about something foolish: Caleb's work schedule, his inability to attend a school function, his constant promises of next time, and when things settled down. Danny had accused him of caring more about his job than his family, and in his anger and exhaustion, Caleb had said things he could never take back. 3 days later, Danny was dead, a car accident on a rain-slicked road, driving too fast because he was angry and hurt and 18 years old. The last words they had spoken to each other were harsh ones, and that weight had been crushing Caleb ever since. Now, staring at this unknown boy's photograph in an abandoned mine, That familiar guilt crashed over him again. Here was another child, another family that had been torn apart by forces beyond their control. The difference was that this time, he might be able to do something about it. Rusty whined softly, pressing against Caleb's leg in a gesture that seemed to offer both comfort and encouragement. The dog's patient presence reminded him that grief, while necessary, could not be allowed to paralyze him when others needed help. Caleb closed the locket carefully and slipped it into his pocket alongside the other artifacts. 3 children now, Jake from the photograph, the unknown boy in the locket, and his own Danny, whose memory seemed to be guiding him towards something he didn't yet understand. They emerged from the mine to find the morning clouds breaking apart, allowing patches of sunlight to fall across the scarred landscape. But as they began the walk back toward town, Caleb noticed they were no longer alone. A figure stood beside the abandoned equipment near the road, Mrs. Henderson, leaning heavily on her walking stick and watching their approach with obvious anxiety. "I was hoping I might find you out here," she said when they drew near. Her voice was barely above a whisper, and she glanced around nervously, as if afraid someone might be listening. "Mrs. Henderson," Caleb replied. "This is quite a walk from town. I used to come here often years ago. My husband worked these mines for 30 years, before they closed them down." She paused, studying Caleb's face with the intensity of someone trying to make a difficult decision. "I think you found something in there, didn't you? Something that belonged to one of the children." Caleb's hand moved instinctively to his pocket, but he said nothing. Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice growing even quieter. "There were 7 of them. 7 children who disappeared the day the mine collapsed. September 15th, 1993. The company said it was an accident, that the children had been playing where they shouldn't have been. But that wasn't true. What really happened? They were supposed to be in school that day, but the school had been evacuated because of gas leaks from the mine. The company had been cutting corners, ignoring safety regulations, pushing the workers to extract more ore faster. The children were sent home, but some of them came up here instead. They wanted to see where their fathers worked. Mrs. Henderson's eyes filled with tears. The collapse wasn't an accident. It was caused by unsafe blasting practices, by equipment that should have been replaced years earlier. But by the time the rescue teams arrived, it was too late. The children were buried so deep that recovering their bodies would have required acknowledging how dangerous the mine had become. So they covered it up. Worse than that, they claimed the children had run away together, that they had probably been picked up by someone passing through town. It was easier than admitting corporate negligence had killed 7 kids. Easier than paying compensation to the families. Easier than explaining why safety warnings had been ignored for months. Caleb felt anger building in his chest. The familiar rage that came when he thought about powerful people destroying innocent lives for their own convenience. The families went along with this? What choice did they have? The company owned everything. The houses, the jobs, the local government. Speak out and lose everything. Keep quiet and at least survive. Mrs. Henderson wiped her eyes with a trembling hand. Most of the families left town within a year. Couldn't stand to stay in a place that had swallowed their children and then lied about it. But you stayed. Someone had to remember. Someone had to keep the truth alive, even if it could never be spoken. She looked at Rusty, who had been listening to their conversation with what seemed like understanding. And someone had to take care of him. You've been feeding the dog all these years. He showed up right after the collapse, wandering around the mine entrance like he was looking for someone. I think he belonged to one of the children, though I was never sure which one. He's been waiting ever since, as if he knows they're still down there somewhere. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to form a complete picture, and it was uglier than Caleb had imagined. 7 children dead, their families driven away, their memory erased by corporate convenience and official silence. And 1 loyal dog, spending 30 years trying to bring someone back to look for his lost friend. Mrs. Henderson, Caleb said quietly, I think it's time someone listened to what Rusty has been trying to say. The administrative building for the old Millhaven Mining Company sat at the edge of town like a monument to abandoned ambition. 3 stories of brick and steel. It had once housed the offices that coordinated one of the largest mining operations in the region. Now its windows were dark, its parking lot cracked and overgrown with weeds, and its front entrance secured, with chains and warning signs about structural instability. But Caleb had noticed something during his walks around town. While the front of the building was clearly abandoned, the rear showed signs of occasional use. Tire tracks in the dirt, footprints near a service entrance, and the faint smell of cigarette smoke that suggested recent human presence. He decided to investigate after midnight, when the town was asleep and curious eyes were less likely to be watching. Rusty joined him without invitation, appearing silently beside the boarding house as Caleb slipped out through the back door. The dog's behavior had changed since their conversation with Mrs. Henderson. He seemed more focused, more urgent, as if the telling of the story had awakened memories he had been carrying for 3 decades. The service entrance to the building was secured with a simple padlock that showed signs of regular use. Caleb had learned a few practical skills during his years of traveling work, and the lock yielded to his efforts after several minutes of careful manipulation. The door opened with a creak that seemed loud enough to wake the entire town, but no lights appeared in nearby windows, and no sounds of alarm broke the night silence. Inside, the building retained the institutional smell of old offices, stale coffee, dusty paper, and the lingering chemical scent of mimeograph machines and carbon paper. Caleb's flashlight revealed hallways lined with empty rooms, their doors standing open to show spaces that had been cleared of everything valuable but not quite abandoned. Rusty moved through the building with the confidence of familiarity, leading Caleb up a narrow staircase to the 2nd floor. Here, the hallways were narrower and the rooms smaller, management offices rather than the clerical spaces below. At the end of the hall, Rusty stopped beside a door marked Chief Financial Officer J. Hartwell. The door was locked, but like the entrance below, it showed signs of recent use. Caleb worked on the lock while Rusty waited patiently, occasionally whining softly as if responding to sounds or scents that human senses couldn't detect. Inside Hartwell's former office, Caleb found evidence that someone had been using the space recently. A desk lamp that worked when he tested it, a chair that had been adjusted to accommodate someone much shorter than the room's original occupant, and most tellingly, several boxes of documents that had clearly been brought here from elsewhere. Rusty immediately went to one of the boxes and began pawing at it urgently. When Caleb opened it, he found financial records dating back to the early 1990s, ledger books, correspondence, and what appeared to be duplicate copies of reports that should have been filed with various regulatory agencies. But it was the leather-bound ledger at the bottom of the box that caught his attention. Unlike the other documents, this one was marked Private J. Hartwell Only and secured with a small brass lock. The lock proved even easier to open than the doors had been, and what Caleb found inside made his blood run cold. The ledger contained a detailed record of bribes, kickbacks, and regulatory violations spanning nearly 5 years. Payments to county inspectors to overlook safety violations. Money paid to state officials to expedite permits without proper environmental reviews. Bonuses given to mine supervisors for exceeding production quotas, despite knowing that the accelerated schedule required cutting safety. Corners. But most damning were the entries from the summer and fall of 1993. June through September showed increasingly desperate attempts to meet production deadlines, with corresponding increases in both safety violations and payments to officials who agreed to look the other way. The final entries, dated just days before the mine collapse, documented what could only be described as a conspiracy to conceal the true extent of the danger. September 10th, Inspector Gamble agreed to delay safety review for additional 2,000, estimated 3 weeks before conditions require shut down. September 12th, Blasting Supervisor Johnson expressed concerns about structural integrity in shaft. 7. Agreed to continue operations for bonus payment equivalent to 6 months' salary. September 14th, County Emergency Manager Willis will ensure any incident reports classify situation as natural disaster rather than industrial accident. Payment of $5,000 upon completion. September 15th had no entry. That was the day the children died. Caleb felt his hands shaking as he read the clinical documentation of choices that had led directly to 7 young deaths. These were not accidents or miscommunications or tragic coincidences. They were the predictable results of deliberate decisions made by people who valued profit more than human life. Rusty had grown increasingly agitated as Caleb read through the ledger, pacing back and forth and occasionally stopping to stare at the office door as if he heard something approaching. But when Caleb looked up, he saw that the dog's behavior was different from simple nervousness. He seemed to be remembering something painful, reliving experiences that had happened in this very building. "You were here before, weren't you?" Caleb asked quietly. "Someone brought you here, maybe one of the children." "You remember this place?" Rusty whined and approached the desk, sniffing at a section of the wood surface with particular intensity. Caleb examined the area more closely and found what the dog had detected: faint scratches in the wood that looked like they might have been made by small fingernails or perhaps a penknife. Carved into the desk's surface, barely visible after 30 years, were the initials JM, and below them, R plus J forever, Jake and Rusty, the boy from the photograph and his faithful dog, leaving their mark in the office of the man whose financial calculations had cost them both their lives. Caleb photographed several pages of the ledger with his phone, focusing on the entries that documented the conspiracy to conceal safety violations. But as he worked, he became aware of sounds from elsewhere in the building: footsteps, muffled voices, the distant slam of a door. Someone else was in the building, and they were moving with purpose rather than the caution of unauthorized entry. He quickly closed the ledger and returned it to its box, then gathered the other documents he had examined. Rusty was already at the office door, his body tense with alertness. The voices were getting closer. At least 2 people, possibly more, and they seemed to be conducting some kind of systematic search. "Third floor's clear," a man's voice echoed up the stairwell. "Check the second-floor offices. What exactly are we looking for?" replied a second voice, younger and less certain. "Anything that outsider might have found." Hartwell was careless about what he left here. "Should have cleaned this place out years ago." Caleb's blood chilled as he recognized the first voice: Sheriff Morrison. The second was probably Deputy Collins, which meant this was an official search, or at least one being conducted under official authority. But a search for what? Unless they knew about the ledger, knew about the evidence that had been hidden in this building for 30 years, waiting for someone to find it and understand its significance. Rusty led him to the office window, which overlooked the rear of the building. It was a longer drop than Caleb would have preferred, but the voices were getting closer, and he could hear doors being opened and closed as the searchers worked their way down the hallway. He climbed through the window as quietly as possible and hung from the sill before dropping to the ground below. The impact jarred his knees and sent a sharp pain through his left ankle, but nothing seemed to be broken. Rusty had already found an alternative route down and was waiting near the building's rear corner. As they moved away from the building, staying in the shadows cast by old equipment and storage sheds, Caleb could see lights moving behind the windows of the second floor. The search was thorough and systematic. These men knew what they were looking for and where they might find it. The implication was chilling. If Sheriff Morrison was involved in searching for evidence of the cover-up, then the corruption documented in Hartwell's ledger had never really ended. It had simply evolved, adapted, found new ways to protect itself from exposure. Caleb thought about the names in the ledger: officials who had taken bribes, supervisors who had ignored safety warnings, inspectors who had looked the other way while children played near a mine that was ready to collapse. Some of those people were probably dead by now, but others might still be alive, still in positions of authority, still willing to protect their secrets. Richard Blackwood's threat from the previous night took on new meaning. This was not just about keeping an old tragedy buried. It was about protecting living people from the consequences of their past actions. But as Caleb and Rusty made their way back through the dark streets toward the boarding house, he carried with him the digital photographs of Hartwell's ledger and the growing certainty that some secrets were too important to stay buried. Regardless of who wanted them to remain hidden, 7 children deserved better than to be forgotten for the convenience of powerful men. And somewhere in the darkness behind them, those same powerful men were working to ensure that the truth would never see daylight. The question now was whether one aging cowboy and one loyal dog would be enough to finally bring justice to Millhaven, or whether the forces that had successfully concealed the truth for 30 years would prove too strong to overcome. Dawn came gray and cold, with the promise of the first real storm of the season building in the western sky. Caleb had spent the remainder of the night reviewing the photographs he had taken of Hartwell's ledger, memorizing names and dates and the careful documentation of choices that had led to tragedy. The evidence was damning, but he understood now that evidence alone would not be enough. The corruption documented in those pages had deep roots and powerful protectors. Sheriff Morrison's midnight search of the mining company building proved that the conspiracy to conceal the truth was still active, still willing to take risks to protect itself from exposure. Mrs. Santos served breakfast in silence, but her worried glances suggested she was aware that Caleb's situation in Millhaven had become dangerous. When Rusty appeared at the kitchen door, as he had the previous morning, she fed him without comment, though her hands shook slightly as she set down the bowl. "You don't have to keep doing this," Caleb told her quietly. "Helping me, I mean. It could cause trouble for you." "Some troubles are worth having," she replied. But her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen what happened to people who chose the wrong side in a town like Millhaven. After breakfast, Caleb saddled Sage and loaded his few belongings onto the pack horse. To anyone watching, it would appear he was preparing to leave town, which was exactly the impression he wanted to create. But instead of heading toward the main road, he guided the horses to a secluded spot near the abandoned mine where Rusty had shown him the locket, and left them ground-tied in a grove of cottonwoods where they would be hidden from casual observation. Rusty was waiting for him at the mine entrance, but his behavior had changed again. The urgency that had characterized his previous guidance was replaced by something deeper, a solemnity that seemed to acknowledge they were approaching something sacred and terrible. This time, instead of leading Caleb to the side tunnel where they had found the locket, Rusty headed deeper into the main shaft. The passage here was more dangerous. Ceiling timbers showed signs of stress, and the floor was uneven with fallen rock and pools of stagnant water. But the dog moved forward with confidence, as if following a path he had walked many times before. The main shaft extended much farther than Caleb had expected, sloping gradually downward into the heart of the mountain. The air grew thicker and more oppressive as they descended, and his flashlight beam seemed to be absorbed by the surrounding darkness rather than illuminating it effectively. After what felt like nearly half a mile of careful walking, Rusty stopped beside what appeared to be a natural cave formation that intersected with the man-made tunnel. The opening was partially concealed by fallen timber and accumulated debris, but the dog squeezed through without hesitation. Caleb followed, emerging into a natural chamber that was larger than anything he had expected to find. His flashlight revealed a space, perhaps 20 feet across and 15 feet high, with walls of natural stone that predated the mining operation by millions of years. But what stopped his breath was not the geological wonder of the chamber, it was what someone had created there. Against the far wall stood a hand-carved wooden cross, perhaps 4 feet tall and clearly crafted with great care and skill. At its base was a carefully arranged collection of objects, toys, photographs, items of clothing, and other personal belongings that had clearly meant something to children. But most moving of all were the 7 small stones arranged in a semicircle around the cross, each one carved with a name and a date. Tommy Hartwell, age 9. Sarah Chen, age 8. Jake Morrison, age 10. Michael Santos, age 7. Lisa Rodriguez, age 9. David Kim, age 8. Emma Thompson, age 10. All bore the same date. September 15, 1993. Caleb approached the memorial slowly, overwhelmed by the realization that he was standing in a place of profound grief and love. Someone had created this shrine to honor the children who had died. Someone who had cared enough to venture deep into a dangerous mine to build a place where their memory could live. But as he examined the cross more closely, he saw that it bore an inscription carved deep into the wood. Truth will find its way. Love never dies. A father who remembers. Rusty had positioned himself beside one of the carved stones, the one marked Jake Morrison, age 10. He lay down with his head resting on his paws, but his eyes remained alert and fixed on Caleb, as if waiting for some kind of acknowledgement or understanding. Jake Morrison, the boy from the photograph, the owner of the wooden horse, the child who had carved his initials into the desk of the man whose greed had killed him. And Rusty had been Jake's dog, had probably followed the boy to the mine that day, had perhaps been the only witness to what had really happened when the shaft collapsed. "You've been trying to bring someone here for 30 years, haven't you?" Caleb said quietly, kneeling beside the dog. "Trying to show someone what really happened, trying to make sure they weren't forgotten." Rusty's tail moved once against the stone floor, a gesture that seemed to confirm what Caleb had guessed. This loyal animal had spent 3 decades waiting for someone who would listen, someone who would care enough to see the truth and act on it. The implications of the memorial's location were staggering. If the cross and stones were here, deep in the main shaft of the mine, then this was where the children had been when the collapse occurred. Not playing in dangerous areas against their parents' warnings, as the official story claimed, but exploring the main tunnel that should have been safe. That would have been safe if the company had not cut corners and ignored warnings about structural instability. Caleb studied the chamber more carefully, looking for signs of the collapse that had taken 7 young lives. The natural stone wall showed no damage, but the timber supports near the entrance bore clear evidence of catastrophic failure, splintered beams, twisted metal, and the kind of stress patterns that spoke to sudden, violent structural collapse. But someone had cleared this area, had removed enough debris to create the memorial chamber. The same person who had carved the cross, who had gathered the children's belongings, who had spent countless hours in this dark place, ensuring their memory would survive even if their bodies could never be recovered. As Caleb examined the belongings arranged around the cross, his hands stopped when they encountered a familiar object, a wooden horse, identical to the one he carried in his pocket. This one was painted in different colors, but the craftsmanship was unmistakably the same. Carved into its side were the initials SC, Sarah Chen, according to the memorial stone. A father who remembers. Caleb read the inscription again, understanding now what it meant. One of the parents had refused to accept the official story, had spent years creating this place of remembrance, had trusted that someday the truth would surface and justice would be served. The weight of that trust, that faith in eventual justice, settled on Caleb's shoulders like a physical burden. Here was a parent who had lost everything but had not given up hope that someone would eventually care enough to listen. Someone like Caleb, who carried his own guilt about failing to protect his son, who understood the crushing weight of regret and the desperate need for redemption. Rusty stood and moved to the chamber entrance, then returned to sit beside Jake's memorial stone. His message was clear. They had seen what needed to be seen, learned what needed to be learned. Now it was time to decide what to do with that knowledge. As they made their way back through the mine shaft, Caleb's resolve hardened with each step. The memorial chamber had shown him the cost of allowing corruption and greed to go unchallenged. 7 children had paid that price, and their families had been forced to suffer in silence for 30 years. But when they emerged from the mine, they found evidence that their activities had not gone unnoticed. Tied to Sage's saddle was a piece of paper that had not been there when Caleb left the horses. In crude block letters, someone had written, Some secrets are worth dying for. Leave town today or find out how serious we are. Caleb crumpled the note and looked around the grove where he had hidden the horses. There was no sign of whoever had left the message, but the fact that they had found him here, in a location he had chosen specifically for its concealment, suggested that his movements were being watched more closely than he had realized. Rusty growled softly, his hackles raised as he scanned the surrounding landscape. Whatever human scents he detected, they were recent enough to put him on alert. Caleb faced a choice that would define everything that followed. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to heed the warning and leave Millhaven immediately. He had gathered enough evidence to understand what had happened, and that knowledge could provide a measure of closure for his own need to do something meaningful in Danny's memory. But riding away would mean abandoning the memorial in the mine shaft, abandoning the parent who had spent years creating a place where the children's memory could survive, abandoning Mrs. Henderson and the other townspeople who had lived with the weight of this secret for 3 decades. Most importantly, it would mean abandoning Rusty, who had waited 30 years for someone to follow him to the truth. Caleb mounted Sage and gathered the reins. But instead of turning toward the road out of town, he guided the horses back toward Millhaven. The anonymous threat had made his choice clear, not because it frightened him, but because it confirmed that the people responsible for the cover-up were still active, still dangerous, still willing to silence anyone who threatened their secrets. 7 children deserved better than to be forgotten for the convenience of powerful men. One loyal dog deserved to see his vigil finally come to an end. And one aging cowboy, who had failed to protect his own son, finally had a chance to ensure that other parents' children would not be forgotten. The storm clouds were building in the west, but Caleb rode toward them rather than seeking shelter. Some fights were worth having regardless of the odds, and some truths were worth defending, regardless of the cost. The confrontation came sooner than Caleb had expected. He had barely reached the outskirts of Millhaven when Sheriff Morrison's patrol car appeared in his path, blocking the dirt road that led back to town. The sheriff emerged from the vehicle with deliberate slowness, his hand resting on his weapon in a gesture that was unmistakably threatening. "Mr. Boone," Morrison called across the distance between them. "I thought we had reached an understanding about your visit to our town." Caleb brought Sage to a stop, but remained mounted, keeping his hands visible and non-threatening. "Just out for a morning ride, Sheriff. Beautiful country you have here." "Yes, it is. Peaceful country, too. The kind of place where people value their privacy and don't appreciate strangers poking around where they don't belong." Morrison stepped closer, his posture radiating barely controlled aggression. "The kind of place where accidents can happen to people who don't listen to good advice." Rusty had been trotting alongside Sage, but now he moved to position himself between Caleb and the sheriff. The dog's body language had changed completely. Gone was the patient, intelligent companion of the past few days, replaced by an animal that recognized danger and was prepared to defend against it. "That's an interesting dog you have there," Morrison said, his voice carrying a new edge. "Reminds me of another dog I used to know. One that caused me a lot of trouble years ago." "Dogs tend to look alike," Caleb replied, but something in Morrison's tone suggested this was not casual conversation. "Not this one. This one's special. This one's been waiting a long time for the right person to come along, haven't you, boy?" Morrison's hand moved closer to his weapon. "Question is, are you the right person or just another problem that needs to be solved?" The sheriff's words confirmed what Caleb had begun to suspect. This was not a chance encounter, and Morrison's interest in him went beyond normal concern about a stranger in town. The man knew about Rusty, knew about the connection between the dog and the events of 30 years ago. "I'm just passing through," Caleb said carefully. "No intention of causing problems for anyone." "See, that's where I think you're lying to me." Morrison drew his weapon now, holding it at his side but ready to use. "Because a man who's just passing through doesn't spend his nights breaking into buildings that don't belong to him, doesn't go exploring abandoned mines where he has no business being." Caleb's mind raced. If Morrison knew about his activities, then the sheriff had been watching him more closely than he had realized. But the man's hostility went beyond professional suspicion. There was something personal in his anger, something that spoke to old grievances and carefully guarded secrets. "Sheriff," Caleb said, trying to keep his voice calm and reasonable, "if I've violated any laws, we can discuss it like civilized people. No need for weapons. Oh, but there is, Mr. Boone, because some violations can't be handled through normal channels. Some problems require more direct solutions." Morrison raised his weapon, pointing it directly at Caleb, just like they did 30 years ago. The admission hung in the air between them like a confession. Morrison had just acknowledged involvement in events from 1993, and his willingness to threaten an armed citizen suggested he had been involved in more than just administrative cover-ups. That was when Rusty attacked. The dog moved faster than Caleb would have thought possible, covering the distance between himself and Morrison in a single bound. The sheriff's shot went wide as 80 pounds of enraged canine knocked him backward, and his weapon flew from his grasp to land several feet away in the dirt. Morrison hit the ground hard with Rusty on top of him, snapping and growling with a ferocity that spoke to years of suppressed anger and loyalty finally given outlet. The sheriff screamed and tried to protect his face and throat, but the dog's attack was focused and relentless. Caleb dismounted quickly and moved to retrieve Morrison's weapon, though he kept his distance from the struggle between man and dog. After several moments, Rusty backed away from the sheriff, who lay gasping and bleeding from multiple bite wounds on his arms and chest. "Call him off!" Morrison gasped, terror evident in his voice. "Call him off before he kills me!" "He's not my dog to call off," Caleb replied, though he whistled softly to Rusty. The dog reluctantly moved away from Morrison, but remained alert and ready to attack again. Morrison struggled to sit up, his uniform torn and stained with blood. But as he moved, something fell from his shirt pocket, a small dark object that clinked against the hard-packed earth. Caleb bent to examine it and felt his blood freeze. It was a sheriff's badge, but not Morrison's current one. This was older, tarnished with age, and stained with what could only be dried blood. Engraved on the back were the initials, TH, and the date, 1993. "Tom Henderson," Caleb said quietly, understanding flooding through him. "This belonged to Tom Henderson." Morrison's face went white. "You don't understand what you're looking at. I understand perfectly. This is the badge of the man who was sheriff 30 years ago. The man who tried to investigate what really happened to the children." Caleb studied the bloodstains on the metal surface. "The man you killed to keep him quiet." "It wasn't supposed to happen that way," Morrison said, his voice breaking. "Tom was my partner, my friend." But he wouldn't let it go. He kept pushing, kept asking questions, kept threatening to go to the state investigators. "So you silenced him." The company made it clear what would happen if the truth came out. Not just to the people directly involved, but to the whole town. Millhaven would have died completely if that mine closed down and the lawsuits started flying. Hundreds of people would have lost everything. Morrison's justification sounded like something he had been telling himself for 3 decades, a story crafted to make murder seem like necessity. But Caleb could hear the hollowness in it, the desperation of a man who had crossed a line he could never uncross. "What about the parents?" Caleb asked. "What happened to the families of the children?" "Most of them left on their own. Couldn't stand to stay in a place that reminded them of what they'd lost." Morrison wiped blood from his mouth with a shaking hand. "But a few of them wouldn't let go. They kept asking questions, demanding investigations, threatening to go to the media. And accidents happen in small towns. Car crashes on dangerous roads, house fires in old buildings with faulty wiring. People slip and fall in remote areas where help might not arrive in time." Morrison's voice had taken on a mechanical quality, as if he was reciting a list he had memorized long ago. The horror of what Morrison was describing settled over Caleb like a physical weight. Not only had the mining company covered up the children's deaths, but they had systematically eliminated anyone who threatened to expose the truth. The scale of the conspiracy was far larger than he had imagined. "Mrs. Henderson," Caleb said suddenly, understanding why the elderly woman had been so nervous about speaking to him. "She's not just someone who remembers. She's a survivor." Morrison's silence was confirmation enough. Her husband Tom was the sheriff who wouldn't be silenced. And she's been living with the knowledge that speaking out would mean death. Caleb felt anger building in his chest. "How many people did you kill to protect this secret?" "I didn't have a choice." Morrison's voice cracked. The company made it clear that cooperation meant survival and resistance meant elimination. "What was I supposed to do? Let them kill me too?" "You were supposed to do your job. You were supposed to protect people, not murder them." Morrison struggled to his feet, clutching his injured arm. "You think you understand what happened here? But you don't. This isn't just about one mining accident and some dead kids. This is about a network that reaches all the way to the state capital, maybe beyond. The people who ordered those deaths, who ordered the cover-up, they're still out there, still in power, still protecting their interests." Richard Blackwood. Blackwood's just the local face. The real power is in corporate boardrooms and government offices where people wear suits and make decisions that affect thousands of lives. Without ever getting their hands dirty, Morrison was backing toward his patrol car now, leaving a trail of blood drops in the dirt. "You think finding evidence will matter? You think anyone in authority will care about what happened to some children 30 years ago?" "I think the truth matters," Caleb replied. "I think those children deserve justice, and their families deserve to know what really happened to them." Morrison reached his patrol car and fumbled for the radio microphone. "You're a dead man, Boone. Just like Tom Henderson was, just like anyone else who gets too close to the truth. They'll make it look like an accident, and this town will go back to keeping its secrets." But before Morrison could complete his radio call, Rusty was moving again. The dog launched himself at the open car door, knocking Morrison away from the radio and sending him sprawling in the dirt once more. This time the sheriff did not get up. Whether from blood loss, shock, or the dawning realization that his 30-year secret was finally unraveling, Morrison lay still, except for the rapid rise and fall of his chest. Caleb approached the patrol car and used the radio to call for medical assistance, though he made no mention of the circumstances that had led to Morrison's injuries. Then he searched the vehicle and found what he was looking for, a file folder hidden beneath the front seat, marked Hartwell Mining Incident, 1993, confidential. Inside were photographs, witness statements that had never been filed, and most damning of all, a list of names with dates beside them. Tom Henderson's name was at the top, followed by 6 others, all people who had asked too many questions about the mining accident, and all people who had died in accidents over the following 2 years. Mrs. Henderson's name was on the list, but it had been crossed out in red ink. Beside it, someone had written, "Cooperative monitoring required." She had not been killed because she had agreed to remain silent. For 30 years, she had lived under a death sentence that would be carried out the moment she spoke about what she knew. Rusty had moved away from Morrison and was standing at the edge of the road, looking back toward the hills beyond Millhaven. His posture suggested there was more to show, more pieces of the puzzle that needed to be revealed. "What is it, boy?" Caleb asked, joining the dog. "What else do you need me to see?" Rusty began walking toward a section of the hillside that Caleb had not explored before. This area was more heavily wooded, with thick stands of pine trees that provided cover from observation. As they climbed, Caleb could see evidence of old roads or trails that had been deliberately obscured, as if someone had worked to ensure this area remained hidden. At the top of a small ridge, Rusty stopped beside what appeared to be a natural depression in the landscape. But closer examination revealed it was not natural at all. It was a carefully concealed mass grave, marked only by 7 small stones, arranged in a pattern that mirrored the memorial in the mine shaft. The children's bodies, hidden here for 30 years, while their families were told they had run away and their memory was erased from official records. But these 7 stones were not the only markers. Scattered around the hidden grave were additional stones bearing other names, other dates. Tom Henderson's name was among them, along with the 6 other names from Morrison's list. The scope of the conspiracy was even larger than Caleb had imagined. Not only had the mining company covered up the children's deaths, but they had systematically murdered anyone who threatened to expose the truth, creating a body count that spanned multiple years and included both parents seeking justice and officials who refused to be bought. Rusty sat beside Jake Morrison's stone and looked up at Caleb with an expression that seemed to convey both satisfaction and sadness. After 30 years, someone finally knew the truth. Someone finally understood what had happened in this quiet town, where secrets were buried deeper than bodies and silence was enforced at gunpoint. But understanding the truth and acting on it were different things entirely. And as Caleb stood beside the hidden grave of 7 children and their murdered parents, he realized that the real fight was just beginning. The emergency medical team that arrived to treat Sheriff Morrison asked no questions about how he had sustained his injuries, which told Caleb everything he needed to know about how thoroughly the conspiracy controlled local institutions. The paramedics worked with the efficient silence of people who had learned not to see too much or remember too many details. While Morrison was loaded into the ambulance, Caleb made his way to Mrs. Henderson's house, a small, well-maintained cottage 2 blocks from the main street that showed the careful attention of someone who took pride in what little they could control. She answered his knock before he could raise his hand to the door, as if she had been watching for his arrival. "You found it," she said quietly, looking past him to where Rusty sat patiently on her front porch. "You found where Tom is buried?" "Among others," Caleb replied. "I think we need to talk." Mrs. Henderson led him through a living room that spoke of a life lived carefully and modestly, with photographs on the mantelpiece that showed happier times, a younger version of herself with a man in a sheriff's uniform, both of them smiling with the confident happiness of people who believed the world was fundamentally fair. "Tom was a good man," she said, settling into a worn armchair that had clearly been his favorite. "Maybe too good for a place like this." He believed that badge meant something, that being sheriff meant protecting people even when it was difficult. He tried to investigate the children's deaths. He tried to do his job. Tom knew those children hadn't run away. He had talked to every one of their families, knew how much they were loved. When the company tried to sell that story, he started asking questions that made powerful people nervous. Mrs. Henderson's hands shook slightly as she poured tea from a pot that had been waiting on the side table. "Morrison came to our house one night in October, said he had new information about the case, wanted Tom to meet him up at the old mine to discuss it privately. Tom thought he was finally getting somewhere, that someone was ready to tell the truth." She paused, staring into her teacup as if it held memories too painful to speak aloud. "He never came home. Morrison said there had been an accident, that Tom had fallen into an unstable shaft while investigating a lead. Said the area was too dangerous to recover his body safely. But you knew better. A wife knows." Mrs. Henderson's voice carried the weight of 30 years of suppressed grief and anger. "Tom was careful around dangerous ground. He'd been a sheriff for 15 years, knew how to handle himself in rough country. But I also knew Morrison had been acting strange for weeks, nervous and secretive. And I knew the company had been asking questions about Tom's investigation." Caleb studied the photographs on the mantelpiece more carefully. In addition to images of Tom Henderson in his sheriff's uniform, there were pictures of him with several children, some of whom Caleb recognized from the memorial stones in the hidden grave. He knew some of the victims personally. Caleb observed, Tom coached Little League Baseball. Jake Morrison was his star pitcher, and Sarah Chen was the best shortstop he'd ever seen. They weren't just names in a case file to him. They were kids he'd watched grow up. Kids who called him Uncle Tom and asked him to help them with their homework. The personal connection explained the intensity of Tom Henderson's investigation and why the company had felt it necessary to eliminate him. A sheriff investigating abstract crimes might be manageable, But one seeking justice for children he had loved was a threat that could not be contained. "Mrs. Henderson," Caleb said carefully, "I found Morrison's files. I know you've been living under threat for 30 years, that they've kept you silent by making it clear what would happen if you spoke out." She nodded, tears starting to flow freely now. "They made examples of others. The Chen family died in a house fire 3 months after Tom disappeared. The Santos family's car went off the road during a snowstorm that winter. Always accidents, always plausible, always final. But you survived because you agreed to keep quiet." "I was a coward," she said, the words heavy with self-recrimination. "I chose to live in silence rather than die for the truth. I chose to let them get away with murdering my husband and those children because I was afraid. You chose to survive so that someday when the right person came along, the truth could finally be told." Caleb leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "You chose to be a witness, to keep the memory alive until justice became possible." Mrs. Henderson looked up at him with eyes that held both hope and fear. "Is it possible? After all this time, with so many people dead, can anything really be done?" Before Caleb could answer, Rusty began growling low in his throat, his attention focused on the front window. Outside, the sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, multiple cars moving with purpose rather than casual traffic. "They know," Mrs. Henderson whispered, her face going pale. "Someone told them about Morrison, about what you found." Caleb moved to the window and peered through the curtains. 3 black SUVs were parked on the street outside, and men in expensive suits were getting out with the coordinated movements of a professional security team. Richard Blackwood emerged from the lead vehicle, followed by several others who carried themselves with the authority of people accustomed to wielding power. "Mrs. Henderson," Caleb said quietly, "how many people in this town would stand up if they knew they had support? How many would choose justice over safety if they thought they had a chance of surviving it? I don't know. We've all been afraid for so long, it's hard to remember what courage feels like. Then it's time to find out." Caleb turned away from the window and faced her directly. "Those men out there are here to finish what they started 30 years ago. They're going to eliminate everyone who knows the truth, which means they're going to try to kill both of us." Mrs. Henderson's hands had stopped shaking, and her voice grew steadier. "What do you need me to do?" The transformation was remarkable, from frightened widow to determined ally in the space of a few sentences. "Tom Henderson had chosen well when he married this woman. I need you to contact everyone in town who might be willing to help. Tell them what really happened. Tell them that the people responsible are here tonight to silence anyone who might speak out. Tell them that if we don't fight back now, this will never end. And what will you be doing?" Caleb thought about his military training, about the tactical skills he had learned in places where the stakes were life and death, and the enemy was determined to win at any cost. "I'm going to even the odds." Mrs. Henderson used an old party line telephone system to contact the few residents she trusted completely. Within an hour, a small group had assembled in her basement. Mrs. Santos from the boarding house, the elderly man who ran the last remaining grocery store, a retired teacher who had worked at the elementary school, and surprisingly Deputy Collins, whose conscience had apparently finally overcome his fear. "Morrison's in the hospital," Collins reported, his voice shaking with either nerves or adrenaline. "He's alive, but he's talking, telling anyone who'll listen that he was attacked by a rabid dog and a crazy outsider. But he's also asking for a lawyer, which suggests he's more worried about what he might have to explain than what happened to him." "How many men does Blackwood have with him?" Caleb asked. "I counted 8, maybe 10. All professionals, all armed. They've set up a perimeter around the town center, and they're going house to house, asking questions about a man with a dog." Caleb considered the tactical situation. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and operating on unfamiliar ground against opponents who had the advantage of preparation and superior resources. In a straight fight, he would lose quickly and decisively, but this was not going to be a straight fight. "Deputy, I need you to think carefully about the area around the old mine. Are there any structures that might still contain blasting supplies? Anywhere the company might have stored explosives that were never properly disposed of? Collins thought for a moment. There's an old storage bunker about half a mile up the mountain from the main mine entrance. It's been sealed for decades, but Tom Henderson always said it was probably still dangerous because of leftover dynamite and blasting caps. Can you guide me there without being seen? I think so, but what are you planning? Caleb looked around the group of frightened but determined faces. These people had lived with fear for 30 years, had watched their friends and neighbors die or disappear, had been forced to choose between silence and survival. They deserved better than to continue living under the threat of violence from men who valued profit more than human life. I'm planning to make sure that when this is over, the truth comes out and the people responsible face justice. He paused, thinking about Danny and all the ways he had failed to protect his son from the dangers of the world. And I'm planning to make sure that no one else dies to protect their secrets. The bunker Collins led him to was a concrete structure built into the hillside, designed to safely store the large quantities of explosives required for major mining operations. The steel door was rusted shut, but the lock had deteriorated enough that Caleb was able to force it open with a crowbar they found among the abandoned equipment nearby. Inside, protected by the climate-controlled environment, were wooden crates containing sticks of dynamite, blasting caps, and coils of fuse wire. The explosives were old but appeared stable, and there was enough material to level several city blocks if properly deployed. Rusty had followed them to the bunker, but his behavior had changed again. The dog was increasingly agitated, pacing back and forth and whining softly, as if he sensed that events were building toward some kind of climax. The patient waiting that had characterized his behavior for 30 years was giving way to an urgency that seemed to recognize that the time for action had finally arrived. "Easy, boy," Caleb said, checking the condition of the blasting caps. "I know you've been waiting a long time for this. We're going to make sure it ends right." As he worked to prepare the explosives, Caleb found himself thinking about the choices that had led him to this moment. The argument with Danny that had driven his son away in anger. The words he should have said, but didn't. The protection he should have provided but failed to offer. He could not save Danny, could not undo the mistakes that had cost him his son's life. But he could ensure that the 7 children buried in the hidden grave would finally receive justice. He could make certain that Mrs. Henderson and the other survivors would no longer have to live in fear. He could honor the memory of Sheriff Tom Henderson, who had died trying to do what was right. The tactical preparation reminded him of missions he had run decades earlier, in places where the enemy was ruthless and the stakes were measured in innocent lives. The difference was that this time he was not fighting for abstract political goals or distant national interests. This time he was fighting for children who had been murdered and parents who had been silenced and a town that had been held hostage by its own fear. This time the mission was personal. As they prepared to leave the bunker, Caleb carried enough explosives to create a significant distraction and enough evidence to prove what had really happened 30 years ago. But more importantly, he carried the determination of a man who had finally found a way to transform his guilt and regret into something resembling redemption. Rusty led the way down the mountain, no longer the patient guide he had been for the past several days. Now he moved with the focused intensity of a soldier preparing for battle, and Caleb realized that after 3 decades of waiting, the old dog was finally ready to see his vigil come to an end. The confrontation began at precisely 9 o'clock that evening, when Caleb positioned himself on the ridge overlooking the active mining facility. From his vantage point, he could see Blackwood's security team moving through the compound with tactical precision, searching buildings and questioning the few workers who remained on site. They were looking for him, but they were looking in the wrong place. Caleb pulled the cavalry bugle from his pack, a memento from his military service that he had carried for 40 years without ever expecting to use it again. The instrument was tarnished with age, but still functional, and it carried memories of comrades who had stood with him in difficult places, when courage was the only currency that mattered. He had not been able to protect Danny when it counted, had not been there when his son needed him most. But tonight, he could stand for 7 children who had no one else to speak for them, and for a town that had been terrorized into silence for 3 decades. The first blast echoed across the valley as Caleb detonated charges he had placed around the facility's main gate. The explosion was carefully calculated, large enough to destroy the entrance and create chaos, but directed away from any areas where people might be injured. He was not interested in becoming the kind of man who used innocent blood to achieve his goals. As debris settled and alarms began wailing, Caleb raised the bugle to his lips and sounded the charge, 3 clear, piercing notes that had once called cavalry to battle, and now announced that the long silence was finally broken. Blackwood's security team responded exactly as Caleb had anticipated, moving toward the source of the explosion with the disciplined coordination of professional soldiers. But they were operating under the assumption that they were dealing with a single opponent who would either flee or make a desperate stand at the gate. Instead, they found themselves facing an enemy who understood tactical warfare and had spent the afternoon preparing the battlefield to his advantage. The second explosion came from the opposite side of the compound, where Caleb had positioned charges near the equipment yard. This blast was smaller but targeted, designed to disable the vehicles that would allow Blackwood's men to pursue him when the real confrontation began. Rusty had been watching from the shadows near the fence line, and at the sound of the bugle, he moved into action. The dog's role was not to attack. Caleb would not ask an animal to face armed men, but to serve as a spotter and early warning system, using senses that were far superior to human ones to track the movement of enemies in the darkness. Through hand signals they had practiced during the afternoon, Rusty indicated that 4 men were moving toward Caleb's position, while the remaining members of the security team spread out to secure the perimeter. It was exactly the division of forces that Caleb had hoped to achieve. The third blast came as the 4-man team reached the base of the ridge where Caleb had been positioned. But he was no longer there. He had moved to a prepared position 300 yards to the south, where he had clear lines of sight and multiple escape routes. The explosion below served its intended purpose of disorienting the searchers and forcing them to take cover while he repositioned again. For the next hour, Caleb conducted a carefully orchestrated campaign of harassment and misdirection. Small explosions at key locations forced Blackwood's men to respond to multiple threats simultaneously, while the darkness and his knowledge of the terrain allowed him to stay ahead of their attempts to corner him. But the most important part of the plan was happening in town, where Mrs. Henderson was putting 30 years of fear aside to make a series of telephone calls, not to friends or neighbors, but to journalists in the state capital, to federal law enforcement agencies, and to family members of the dead children who had moved away but never forgotten their loss. "This is Eleanor Henderson calling from Millhaven," she said into each phone, her voice growing stronger with each conversation. "I have information about the mining accident that killed 7 children in 1993, and about the murder of my husband Tom Henderson when he tried to investigate. Tonight, the people responsible are here trying to silence the last witnesses." The beauty of the plan was that Blackwood and his men could not silence everyone simultaneously. While they were chasing Caleb through the hills, Mrs. Henderson was systematically destroying the conspiracy's most powerful weapon, its secrecy. By the time Blackwood realized what was happening, it was too late to stop the flow of information. News trucks were already being dispatched from the state capital. Federal investigators were opening files, and family members who had been living with questions for 30 years were demanding answers. The physical battle in the hills was really a distraction from the more important fight taking place in phone booths and newspaper offices and government buildings hundreds of miles away. But Caleb's personal war was just reaching its climax. As midnight approached, he found himself in a direct confrontation with Blackwood and his remaining men at the entrance to the mine shaft where the children had died. The security team had finally managed to corner him, and there was nowhere left to run. "Mr. Boone," Blackwood called across the distance between them, "this has gone far enough. You're outnumbered and outgunned. Surrender now, and we can discuss a reasonable resolution to this situation." "The only reasonable resolution is the truth," Caleb replied, checking the clip in the pistol he had taken from Morrison's patrol car. "And justice for 7 children who died because men like you value profit more than human life. Those children died in an accident. A regrettable accident, but an accident nonetheless. Nothing you do tonight will bring them back or change what happened. Maybe not. But it might prevent you from killing anyone else to protect your secrets." Blackwood's laugh was cold and professional. "You think this ends with me? You think eliminating one middle manager will somehow bring down an organization that reaches into corporate boardrooms and government offices across the country? You're fighting a war you can't possibly win." "Maybe," Caleb agreed. "But sometimes the point isn't winning. Sometimes the point is just making sure you don't go down quietly." The firefight that followed was brief but intense. Caleb had the advantage of cover and darkness, but Blackwood's men had superior numbers and firepower. Bullets sparked off rocks and shattered trees as both sides maneuvered for better positions. It was Rusty who turned the tide. The dog had been circling the battle site, using his superior night vision and hearing to track the movement of Blackwood's men. When one of the security team members tried to flank Caleb's position, Rusty was waiting in the shadows. The man's scream of surprise and pain, as 80 pounds of determined canine knocked him to the ground, was followed by the clatter of his weapon being dropped beyond reach. The distraction was exactly what Caleb needed to shift his position and gain a clearer shot at the remaining threats. By the time the immediate fighting ended, 3 of Blackwood's security team were down, wounded but alive, and Blackwood himself was trapped in a position where surrender was his only option. "It's over," Caleb said, keeping his weapon trained on the corporate executive. "Your men are down, your operation is exposed, and by now half the law enforcement agencies in the state know what happened here." Blackwood's face showed no emotion as he raised his hands in surrender. "You have no idea what you've started. The people I work for don't forgive failure, and they don't leave loose ends untied. Then I guess we'll find out how far their reach really extends." As sirens began wailing in the distance, genuine emergency responders this time, not the corrupted local officials who had covered up the truth for 3 decades. Caleb found himself thinking about Danny and the words they should have said to each other, but never had the chance to speak. He could not bring his son back, could not undo the argument that had driven them apart, or the accident that had made reconciliation impossible. But he had finally found a way to transform his guilt and regret into something resembling justice. 7 children would finally be remembered properly. 1 loyal dog would finally see his vigil ended. And 1 aging cowboy would finally understand that redemption was not about erasing the past, but about ensuring that future generations would not have to pay the same terrible price for other people's greed. The state police arrived 20 minutes later. But they were not alone. Sheriff Morrison had apparently made more phone calls from the hospital than anyone had realized, because the convoy that pulled up to the mine site included vehicles from the FBI, the State Attorney General's office, and what appeared to be federal marshals. Caleb watched from his position near the mine entrance as the various law enforcement agencies sorted out jurisdiction and began processing the scene. Blackwood and his surviving security team were already in custody, but the night was far from over. "Mr. Boone," called a woman in a federal marshal's jacket, approaching with her hands visible and non-threatening. "I'm Deputy Marshal Patricia Santos. We need to talk." The name stopped Caleb cold. "Santos. Any relation to Maria Santos, who runs the boarding house?" "My aunt. She was one of the people who made calls tonight, told us what's been happening here for the past 30 years. Santos paused, studying Caleb's face in the harsh light of the crime scene spotlights. "She also told us you've been carrying evidence that could break this case wide open." Caleb reached slowly into his pocket and withdrew the digital recorder he had been carrying since his confrontation with Morrison. During the firefight, he had managed to activate it and capture not only Blackwood's admissions about the cover-up, but also his casual references to other crimes and other victims. Richard Blackwood just confessed to conspiracy, murder and obstruction of justice, Caleb said, handing over the device. He also implicated his superiors and provided details about operations in other states. Santos accepted the recorder with obvious satisfaction. "This could be exactly what we need to roll up the entire network. We've been investigating mining accidents and suspicious deaths in 4 states, but we've never had a direct connection to the corporate structure behind them." As she spoke, Caleb noticed movement in the shadows beyond the crime scene perimeter. Rusty was there, but his behavior had changed again. The dog was no longer focused on the immediate situation, but seemed to be watching something or someone that the human investigators had not yet noticed. "Marshal," Caleb said quietly, "I think we may have more company." Santos followed his gaze and immediately reached for her radio. "All units, we have possible additional hostile movement beyond the perimeter. Assume armed and dangerous." The response was swift and professional. Spotlights swept the darkness beyond the mine entrance, and officers took defensive positions around the crime scene. But whoever Rusty had detected was already moving, and the situation deteriorated rapidly. The sniper's bullet came from a ridge nearly 400 yards away, an impossible shot in the darkness, except for someone with professional training and night vision equipment. It missed Caleb by inches, shattering a rock beside his head and sending fragments flying. "Everyone down!" Santos shouted, but Caleb was already moving. He recognized the sound of a high-powered rifle and the tactical implications of a sniper with elevated positioning. The crime scene had become a killing field, and everyone in it was exposed. But Rusty had other ideas. The dog launched himself toward Caleb just as the second shot rang out. 80 pounds of loyal canine knocked the cowboy aside, and the bullet that would have killed a man instead struck the animal in the chest. Rusty collapsed with a whine that seemed to carry 30 years of pain and devotion. "No!" Caleb crawled to where the dog lay bleeding in the dirt, his own safety forgotten in the face of seeing his faithful companion wounded. "No, boy, stay with me." Rusty's eyes were already glazing, but he managed to lift his head and look at Caleb one last time. In that gaze was satisfaction, completion, and something that looked remarkably like peace. The dog that had waited 3 decades for justice had finally seen his vigil come to an end. The counter-sniper response was swift and lethal. Federal agents with their own long-range weapons located the shooter's position and returned fire with devastating accuracy. The threat was eliminated within minutes, but the damage was done. As Caleb held Rusty's still form, he felt the familiar weight of loss and regret settling over him. Another companion was gone. Another friend had paid the price for his choices. But this time the grief was different. This time the sacrifice had meant something. "Mr. Boone," Marshal Santos said softly, kneeling beside him, "I'm sorry about your dog. From what my aunt told me, he was special." "He was the reason any of this happened," Caleb replied, his voice thick with emotion. "He spent 30 years trying to bring someone back here, trying to make sure those children weren't forgotten. He never gave up." Santos was quiet for a moment, then said, "Neither did you. The recording you made tonight, combined with the evidence Mrs. Henderson has been preserving, gives us everything we need to prosecute not just the local conspirators, but the corporate network behind them. Around them, the crime scene was being processed with the methodical efficiency of federal investigators, who understood they were dealing with something much larger than a local cover-up. Blackwood was already providing additional information in exchange for consideration. And the phone calls Mrs. Henderson had made were generating investigations in multiple jurisdictions. "It's really over," Caleb asked, still holding Rusty's body. The cover-up is over. The conspiracy is exposed, and 7 children who died 30 years ago are finally going to get justice. Santos stood and called to one of her colleagues. We're going to need a veterinary examiner. This dog was a witness to crimes, and his remains deserve proper handling. As the federal agents continued their work, Caleb found himself thinking about the journey that had brought him to this moment. A chance encounter with a stray dog in a dying town had led to the exposure of corruption that reached into corporate boardrooms and government offices. A father's guilt about failing to protect his son had somehow transformed into justice for other people's children. The cavalry bugle in his pack had sounded its last charge, but the echoes would continue to reverberate through courtrooms and corporate offices for years to come. 7 children would finally be properly mourned and remembered. One loyal dog would finally rest, his duty completed, and one aging cowboy would finally understand that redemption was not about erasing the past, but about ensuring that the future would be built on truth rather than convenient lies. 6 months later, Millhaven looked like a different town entirely. Not in its physical appearance. The buildings were still old, the paint still weathered, the streets still dusty, but in the way people moved through those streets, the way they looked at each other, the way they spoke about the past and the future, the truth had done more than expose corruption. It had lifted a burden that an entire community had been carrying for 30 years. Caleb stood beside the new cemetery that had been established on the hillside overlooking the town. 7 headstones marked the proper graves of the children whose bodies had finally been recovered and returned to their families. The stones were simple but dignified, carved with names and dates and the words, "Beloved children, never forgotten." Beside the children's graves was a smaller marker, crafted from the same local stone but bearing a different inscription. Rusty, faithful friend, keeper of truth, his watch is ended. Mrs. Henderson approached carrying a bouquet of wildflowers, moving with the careful steps of someone whose arthritis troubled her, but whose spirit was finally at peace. She had aged visibly in the months since the truth came out, as if the energy required to maintain 30 years of fearful silence had been enormous, and its release had left her both exhausted and renewed. The trials start next month, she said, kneeling to place flowers on her husband Tom's grave. The prosecutor says they have enough evidence to convict everyone involved, from Morrison and Blackwood all the way up to the corporate executives who ordered the cover-up. Caleb nodded, though his attention was focused on Rusty's grave marker. The dog had been buried with honors befitting a hero, and representatives from law enforcement agencies across the region had attended the ceremony. But for Caleb, the most meaningful moment had been when Mrs. Santos, the boarding house owner, not the federal marshal, had placed a small wooden horse on the grave, identical to the ones he had found in the mine and the memorial chamber. "My grandson carved it," she had explained. "He heard the story and wanted to make sure Rusty had something to remember the children by. Now, 6 months later, that wooden horse remained on the grave. Weathered but intact, a symbol of memory preserved and loyalty rewarded. Have you decided?" Mrs. Henderson asked, settling beside Caleb on the bench that had been placed near the gravesite. "About staying, I mean." It was a question Caleb had been wrestling with for months. The federal investigation had required his testimony and presence, but that phase was largely complete now. He was free to continue his wandering, to resume the aimless drifting that had characterized his life since Danny's death. But Millhaven had changed him, just as he had helped change it. "The town council offered me Tom's old job," he said. "Sheriff of Millhaven. They said they need someone who understands the importance of protecting truth rather than hiding from it." "Tom would have approved of that," Mrs. Henderson replied. "He always said the badge was supposed to mean something." Caleb pulled the tarnished sheriff's star from his pocket, the one Morrison had carried as a trophy, the one that had belonged to Tom Henderson. The blood had been cleaned from it, and the metal had been polished until it gleamed, but Caleb could still feel the weight of what it represented. Not just authority, but responsibility. Not just power, but the obligation to use that power in service of others. I keep thinking about Danny, he said quietly. About all the conversations we never had. All the things I should have taught him about standing up for what's right. You're teaching him now, Mrs. Henderson replied. Just because someone's gone doesn't mean they stop learning from us. Tom's been watching everything that happened here, and I know he's proud of what you accomplished. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant toward evening, casting long shadows across the cemetery and painting the hillside in warm gold. From this vantage point, Caleb could see the entire town spread out below, the main street where he had first encountered Rusty, the schoolhouse where the wooden horse had been hidden, the mine where 7 children had lost their lives and 1 dog had begun a 30-year vigil. But he could also see new construction beginning at the edge of town, where families were moving back to a community that was no longer defined by its secrets. The federal investigation had revealed that mineral rights in the area were more valuable than anyone had realized, and with proper environmental oversight and honest management, mining operations could resume without the corruption and negligence that had characterized the previous company. Mrs. Santos had reopened her boarding house with a waiting list of potential residents. The elementary school was being renovated and would reopen in the fall with its first new students in decades. Even the old mining company building was being converted into a community center that would house a library, meeting rooms, and most importantly, a memorial room dedicated to the 7 children and all the others who had died to protect the truth. There's something else, Mrs. Henderson said, reaching into her purse and withdrawing a small package wrapped in tissue paper. I found this among Tom's things after he died, but I never knew what to do with it. I think it belongs to you now. Inside the tissue paper was a wooden toy horse, identical to the others but bearing different initials, D.B., Danny Boone. Tom carved toys for all the children in town, Mrs. Henderson explained. He started making this one the week before he died, but he never got to finish it. I found it on his workbench with a note that said, "For Caleb's boy, may he always remember that courage is just love with its boots on." Caleb stared at the unfinished toy, overwhelmed by the realization that 30 years ago, a sheriff he had never met had been thinking about his son, had been preparing a gift for a child he would never get to give it to. The connections between past and present, between loss and redemption, between individual choice and community healing seemed too complex and profound for coincidence. He knew, didn't he? Caleb asked. Somehow, Tom knew that someday someone would come who needed to understand that protecting others was the only way to heal from failing to protect those we love most. Mrs. Henderson smiled, the first genuinely happy expression Caleb had seen from her. Tom always said that every ending was really a beginning, and every loss was really a chance to find something more important. As the sun set over Millhaven, Caleb made his decision. He would stay, would accept the badge and the responsibility that came with it. He would help the town continue healing from its 30-year nightmare. And he would ensure that the memorial on the hillside was maintained and honored, so that future generations would remember both the cost of silence and the power of one determined individual to change everything. 7 children had finally found peace. 1 loyal dog had finally completed his mission. And 1 aging cowboy had finally learned that redemption was not about forgetting the past, but about ensuring that its lessons would guide the future towards something better. Some debts,